I'm Najaswat for BizNews, and joining me today is Professor Ted Dinan, Emeritus Professor of Psychiatry at University College Cork, and one of the world's leading experts on the link between our mental health and our guts. Professor Dinan, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
To get started, it's quite an interesting field of expertise, mental health and the guts. What is your medical background?
Well, I did, my medical degree here actually in Ireland, and I suppose clinically I specialised in psychiatry, but I was in New York for a while and in London for a while. I did a PhD in pharmacology, so I suppose really, my background research-wise initially was in pharmacology.
Mm.
I started out kind of recording from single cells in mammalian brains. It was when I was a senior lecturer in Trinity College here in Dublin that I became interested in the brain gut axis. But this was back in the late 80s, early 90s. I was starting out, it was my first faculty post, and nobody really, I suppose, incorporated or thought that the microbes within the gut were important. So I published a series of papers. Frankly, they were not, I won't say they were badly received. They weren't really received at all. Nobody really cited them to any significant extent. They were on the brain gut axis. I thought it was an interesting enough field. And I've lots of friends in gastroenterology, so they were kind of, my accomplices, as it were, in those initial studies. But it's really only within the last 20 years, I suppose, that the role of gut microbes within the gut brain axis has become recognized. And, we about 20 years ago, begun researching this field, thanks largely to, look, as many of your viewers will know, unless you have a lot of money to do research, you can't do really high caliber research. Sometimes you might be lucky and you might do something with very limited resources, but generally speaking, you need a lot of funding. And we were very lucky that the Irish government at the time decided that they were going to fund a number of centres in Ireland, and they were going to provide serious money. I mean, several million a year euros. And they funded our centre. Now, the centre, APC Microbiome Ireland, focuses on gut microbes. It's not all related to the brain, but my group clearly is. So really, I suppose, what I have felt over the last 20 years, and we've obviously published very extensively in all, lots of different types of journals, from basic science to clinical, is that gut microbes do influence brain function.
Mm. So, references to the gut brain have become quite common. Is the gut brain, does it exist and operate independently from the brain?
Well, it doesn't really. I mean, there are a number of parallel routes of communication between the gut and the brain. Some of these are bidirectional. The
Hmm.
brain sends signals to the gut sends signals to the brain. I suppose the obvious bidirectional route would be the vagus nerve, that really long meandering nerve which connects brain and gut. And that does send signals from gut to brain, but also brain to gut. But there are other routes of communication as well. Short chain fatty acids are an important route of communication. Of course, they're very much influenced by diet, but our microbes produce short chain fatty acids. We don't really in any quantities. So if we didn't have microbes, we wouldn't be able to produce short chain fatty acids. And so short chain fatty acids like butyrate and propionate are produced by microbes when they metabolize fiber, and these short chain fatty acids can get into the bloodstream and travel to the brain and influence the brain. Um, then there are other kind of routes of communication as well. I mean, when I was not just when I was a medical student, but until very recently, it was thought in most medical journals and certainly in psychiatric journals that almost all the tryptophan which our brains need. And of course, tryptophan is the building block of serotonin, which regulates mood and appetite and sleep.
Mhm.
And it was thought that all of the tryptophan came from our diet. Well, we now know that in fact microbes can produce tryptophan, and we've shown that, if you ingestion of bifidobacteria, for instance, will increase the production of tryptophan. So, there's some. I mean, there are other routes of communication. I mean, cytokines can be produced at the level of the gut and travel to the brain. Um, and but there are some of the more important routes of communication between gut and brain.
Hmm. So, I think one of the most basic questions when it comes to gut health relating to mental health is the extent to which a healthy gut has an effect on mental illnesses such as depression and anxiety. Can you
Yeah,
elaborate on this?
indeed. Now, I'm a psychiatrist from a very kind of traditional background. I mean, I largely trained in the UK and Ireland, but I've lectured all over the globe basically over the years. And if you had asked me that question, you know, 15 or 20 years ago, I would have probably said, look, the impact is minimal. I'm now of the view really that, you know, psychiatry has really neglected nutrition. There are lots of very good psychological therapies out there. There are drugs that are reasonably good. I think they're as good as the psychological therapies are in terms of evidence. Um, but I do think that diet is very, very important when we talk about mood and anxiety levels. Um, and I do think that, psychiatrists and psychologists, if they're treating people with mood disturbance, should give them dietary advice, which in general they don't. Um, and so I suppose the logical question is, what is the best diet for for mood, for healthy mood, and for dealing adequately with stress? And one would have to say that it's probably a diet that's rich in fruit, vegetables, nuts, fermented foods, and fish. Um, I think that highly processed foods are detrimental to our gut microbiota and are detrimental for our mental health. I mean, you know, if we have a lot of trans fats now, there's been a big effort in many countries and certainly here in Europe to reduce trans fats significantly in the diet. But I am absolutely of the view that trans fats are exceedingly bad. Um, but generally processed foods are bad, and I think that too much red meat is not good for one's mental health. It just isn't. I mean, it's not good for your heart. We've known that for a long while, but I am more and more convinced that it isn't good for one's mental health either. So really, fermented foods, yes, I do think. I mean, most countries have their own, almost all countries have fermented foods. I mean, if you go across Europe or Africa, the continent of Africa or Europe, you find that countries have their own way of fermenting foods. I suppose, I suppose we have a big dairy industry here in Ireland, so yogurt is very readily available. I think it's a very good source of good bacteria. Kefir is a very good source of bacteria. I mean, the Germans clearly like sauerkraut, which I think is an excellent source of good bacteria. But overall, fermented foods are very good, I think, for one's the intestine. And I do think that, having a diet that is rich in fiber, and of course, the Mediterranean type diet is rich in fiber. It's also rich in polyphenols. I mean, when we look at fruits and veg, the more color in them, the better. Because color in fruit and veg is largely, not exclusively, but largely dictated by polyphenol compounds. And these polyphenols, some of them are incredibly good, both for your gut microbiota, and some of them act directly on the brain. So, I mean, polyphenols like, I suppose, resveratrol is one that many people will have heard of because it's present in red wine. Now, you can't go around saying that any alcohol is good for you, at least in Europe at the moment. It's all bad for us, but that's a lot of rubbish as far as I'm concerned. I mean,
Mhm.
everything in moderation. But, resveratrol has been shown to be a very good polyphenolic compound. Um, there are plenty of others. I mean, the curcuminoids. Curcumin is clearly a very good polyphenol. Um, and there are over 1,000 identified polyphenols. There are lots of them. So I would suggest that the more diverse the range of fruit and vegetables we eat, the more polyphenols we're being exposed to, the higher our fiber intake, and the better for our overall gut health and overall mental health.
Mm. So you've made certain references to this in previous answers, but in layman's terms, can you describe what the microbiome does and also how central the composition of a person's microbiome is
Right.
to their overall well-being, particularly in this case, their mental well-being?
Right. Well, the gut microbiota, I mean, consists of bacteria, viruses, fungi, eh, and the dominant uh, uh, source is clearly bacteria. I mean, bacteria have a bigger bulk. I mean, if you look at the weight of bacteria in the average adult intestine, it's over a kilogram in weight. So there's over a kilogram of bacteria. Now, that's really about the weight of the human brain. A kilo to a kilo and a half is about the weight of the human brain. So we have over a kilogram of bacteria in the intestine. We know far more about their activity than we, let's say, do about viruses for a variety of reasons. Um, and when you look at these bacteria, there are about 1,000 strains of identified bacteria in the gut. Um, and certain bacteria we associate as being good bacteria, being particularly good from a mental health perspective. Various lactobacilli have been tested, various bifidobacteria. Now, there are probably lots of other bacteria there that we really haven't looked at all that may be of pivotal importance to mental health, but the ones that really have been most extensively studied now would be lactobacilli and bifidobacteria.
Mm. And the concept of psychobiotics. You are the psychiatrist who developed the concept as
Yeah.
an alternative to antidepressants. So, in layman's terms, what do psychobiotics do? What are they composed of? And how realistic is the possibility that at some stage people would be able to swap out the widespread use of antidepressants by adopting the use of psychobiotics?
Right. Well, psychobiotics are bacteria which, when we
Mm-hmm.
ingest them in adequate amounts, have a positive mental health benefit.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one would have to say that much of the research to date, not all, but much of the research has been preclinical in animals rather than in humans. And when we come to mental health, most, and again, not all of the research has focused on stress. Now, stress is not a disease. We all suffer from stress intermittently, and stress can be a good thing to a point. Of course, when it goes beyond that point, it's not a good thing, but up to a point, it clearly can be beneficial. And most of the research right now has focused on stress. And there is, a lot of evidence out there that certain bacterial species, if they're ingested, improve individuals' capacity to deal with stress. Now, we for instance, you know, we've published on many different bacteria, but there was a biflongum that we published on, and it's actually available. I don't have anything commercially to do with it, but I happen to be one of the people, myself and John Crime were the people who did the initial research on it. It's available in Europe and it's available in the US as well. And basically, this biflongum, when it when it is ingested, it does seem to improve people's capacity to deal with stress. And not only is that an objective capacity improvement because people feel that they can deal more effectively with stress, and of course they and this was placebo controlled, so they didn't know whether they were taking placebo or they were
Yeah.
taking biflongum, but the biflongum seemed to to the individuals to help them deal more effectively with stress. Now, the main stress hormone in humans is cortisol. And what we essentially found was that when people felt they were more effectively capable of dealing with stress, their cortisol levels were lower. So here was a bacteria that reduced stress levels and reduced cortisol as well. We also went on in another study. It was a study looking at, it was placebo controlled, and we were looking at students over 2 semesters here in Cork. And what we did was, when they were doing their exam one semester, we put them on either the placebo or the biflongum, and in the next semester, we put them on the alternative treatment. And we looked primarily at sleep. And what we found was that sleep duration was enhanced during the time they were taking the biflongum, as opposed to when they were taking placebo. So here was as I say, that this particular probiotic is one of a few different probiotics that's on the market at the moment, but it does seem to have a significant impact. Now, you know, I anyone who's prescribed an antidepressant or psychological treatment or a combination thereof, I think right now they should stay on those. I'm not in any sense advocating that people move from conventional antidepressants onto psychobiotics. I suppose I would like to see a point come in time when we do have psychobiotics where there's enough real evidence to indicate that they're at least as good as antidepressants, particularly for people with milder forms of depression, because that's the bulk of depression. I mean, I'm a psychiatrist, so I tend to see people with the more severe forms of depression. But in reality, in primary care, people are seeing GPs see milder forms of depression. And I would like to see naturally occurring substances like psychobiotics available for treating milder forms of depression. I do think that that will happen in the not too distant future, and I think it's something. There's a lot of people, and I think there's a lot of negative attitude towards antidepressants. There was that dreadful paper in molecular psychiatry. I think it was molecular psychiatry there 2 weeks ago, saying that about the serotonin hypothesis and all this. I mean, I don't know. It's hard not to say how bad the paper was. It was diabolical. It made statements that were totally untrue.
How so?
Well, to begin with, you know, it started, well, first of all, it isn't a study at all. All it is an accumulation of studies that they've put together. But the other thing, the core of the paper seems to be that the serotonin hypothesis was wrong. Now, only somebody who was mentally deranged would have believed that the serotonin hypothesis was correct in the first place. I mean, I don't know anyone who went around the place saying that the serotonin hypothesis was correct. I mean, the serotonin hypothesis is a bit like, you know, taking some fairly unsophisticated car engine and comparing it to a rocket or something. I mean, the human brain is far too complex to believe that serotonin could be the sole source of mood dysregulation. I mean, it clearly isn't. I mean, I think back in 1985, I was a registrar in St George's Hospital in London. And I remember writing to the British Journal of Psychiatry at the time saying that, psychiatry has over exaggerated the role of serotonin and noradrenaline, that this is a load of nonsense, basically, is what I said. And that was back in 1985. Well, I mean, we've moved on a bit since then. But really, the look, I really do not believe that anyone who knows anything about brain biology could believe that the serotonin hypothesis was correct. It's very simplistic. I'm not saying that it isn't useful in terms of drug discovery or something like that, if somebody is in the pharmaceutical industry, but it is an oversimplified view of mood disorder, a very, very oversimplified view
So
of.
just to clarify, it's not the outcome of the Moncrieff study that you disagree with. It's the 1960s hypothesis that posited that depression was as a result of low serotonin levels.
Well, I mean, the paper suggests. Well, the paper suggests that antidepressants don't work anyway. I mean, you know, that's nonsense. I mean, there are hundreds of studies out with, hundreds of papers. And, antidepressants they don't work in everyone. And I wish we had better antidepressants. I mean, I
Mm,
really wish as a psychiatrist we had better antidepressants.
mm,
But, you know, this was a paper which is coming from a skeptical angle, and I'm all in favor of skepticism if it's healthy
mm,
skepticism and that it's useful. But
mm,
I'm concerned about patients that I treat who have severe forms of depression, who read nonsense like this when it comes on the front page of the Guardian or the New York Times or the Irish Times here, and they think, gee whiz, I shouldn't be taking these drugs. They're based on a false premise and they don't work. And that for me is very, that's a scary message to send out to
mm,
people who are severely depressed.
mm, mm. Then, just to close off with, before psychobiotics, in the period before they become mainstream, what kinds of foods would you suggest that people consume to get more of this healthy bacteria to assist in the improvement of their mood, mental health balance, and all those good things?
Right. Well, I mean, there are a number of studies out there. We published a paper in which we described what we termed the psychobiotic diet. Felice
Mm,
Jacka has spoken about modified Mediterranean diets. I I think that, when you look at the most widely studied diet in relation to mood, it is the Mediterranean diet. We know that people in the Mediterranean region have lower levels of depression. And certainly Felice Jacka's study, strongly supports the view that if people are clinically depressed and they go on a modified Mediterranean diet, that their symptoms are likely to improve. So to get back to the fruit and veg and the fish, I think that, that is the optimal diet, for somebody who is either suffering from an episode of depression or maybe is prone to episodes of depression. I do think that, people need to stick with, if they're having a psychological intervention like CBT or they're on an antidepressant, they should take those. But I do believe that if you have a healthy gut, which is, brought about by a healthy diet, that is really optimal. And really, what most of the studies on depression, including our own study, have shown is that in depression, the gut microbiota loses diversity. Now, this is especially true, of course, as we age. Elderly people tend to lose diversity of the gut microbiota, and the loss of diversity is associated with frailty. I mean, when you look at elderly people who become frail and they lose muscle mass because of sarcopenia, that in general is associated with a gut microbiota that lacks diversity. So we all want to grow old healthily. Nobody wants to end up as a frail elderly individual. So I think that, whether you're talking about mood disorder or you just simply want to grow old in a healthy way and stave off frailty and the problems that go with that a healthy diet is absolutely essential. And what a healthy diet does is it produces a diverse gut microbiota.
Professor Ted Dinan, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you again for your time.
My
I'm
pleasure.
Nadja Scott for BizNews.com.
Take care. Cheers.